Welcome to the PDA Parenting Podcast. This show will be dedicated to supporting parents raising kids with PDA autism. I'm your host, Amy Kotha, a parent coach and a mom to a PDAer myself. This podcast is here to provide you with practical insights, real-life experiences, and expert guidance to help you better understand your child and to parent from a place of connection, empathy, and understanding. Whether you're new to PDA or you're already familiar with the journey, you're in the right place. Welcome to the podcast. I am so glad that you're here. Today, I am excited to kick things off by giving you a solid introduction to PDA, or pathological demand avoidance. PDA is a subtype of autism, which you probably already know. And if you're hearing about it for the first time, don't worry, you're not alone. In fact, this podcast is just the first of 2 introductory episodes I've designed to give you a foundational understanding of PDA. I'm going to break it down into manageable chunks because seriously, we're all really busy, especially parenting our PDAers. Nobody has hours to spend listening to one podcast in one sitting. So in this episode, I'll be covering some of the broader aspects of PDA from a high level. We'll dig into the details more in future episodes, but today I really want to keep things simple and approachable. Parenting a child with PDA can be overwhelming enough without information overload, am I right? So before we dive in, I want to remind you of something that we've all heard before. Autism is a spectrum, and just like the saying goes, once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And that holds true for PDA as well. So while there are specific characteristics that define PDA, it doesn't look exactly the same for every individual. Strategies that work for one child might not work for another. And that's why, in my opinion, the key to parenting a PDA child is to educate yourself, to meet your child where they are, and to channel your inner scientist. Seriously, experiment with different approaches until you find what works for your child. And that's exactly what I hope to help you do through this podcast. So I've noticed a lot of references to PDA on social media lately, and a lot of people have asked, what is PDA and why am I suddenly hearing about it? Well, you're not imagining things. You are suddenly hearing more about it. PDA is becoming more recognized, thanks in part to organizations like PDA North America and the PDA Society in the UK. So these organizations have been working super hard to spread awareness through social media, books, conferences, and webinars, and their efforts are paying off. So while PDA is still considered an emerging profile of autism, knowledge about it is starting to take off. It's important to note, though, that PDA is not officially recognized in the DSM-5. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the DSM-5 is the American Psychiatric Association's professional reference book on mental health and brain-related conditions. This is the main guide for mental health providers in the United States. And this can make things tricky when it comes to getting services and accommodations for your child. But just because it's not in the DSM does not mean that it doesn't exist. There are plenty of health professionals, even now here in the United States, who are diagnosing children with autism who also present with a PDA profile. If you're looking for a provider who is familiar with PDA, I highly recommend checking out the resource list that is located on PDA North America's website. They are continuously updating it, and there are hundreds of health professionals currently listed. So let's talk a tiny bit about the history of PDA because it feels very new. PDA was first identified in the 1980s by British psychologist Elizabeth Newsom. She noticed that some of the children she worked with had autism, but they also displayed what she called, and I quote, an obsessional avoidance of the ordinary demands of everyday life. So these kids that she was seeing, they didn't quite fit the more typical autism profiles. So she began documenting this new pattern of behaviors, and now we know this to be PDA. So while PDA is on the autism spectrum, it has some unique traits that set it apart. So not only from simple demand avoidance, because everyone experiences demand avoidance on occasion, right? Neurotypical, neurodivergent, just human beings. And this is not that. But PDA also differs from more typical presentations of autism, even the ones that include a level of demand avoidance. So, if you're a parent of a child with PDA or you suspect that you might be, you're likely listening right now because you've been told, maybe countless times as I have, that your child is super complex, that his or her behaviors don't quite fit the original diagnoses that the mental health professional had been considering. The behaviors are a bit different, the treatments aren't moving forward as expected, and the parenting advice that you've been given for years definitely not working. So, this is what often starts parents down the windy, bumpy road of getting their child diagnosed correctly. I know in my experience as a parent of a teen PDAer now, I felt like every diagnosis was just not quite right. Some of them were way off. And my intuition kept me researching and not accepting these answers because I knew there had to be some kind of explanation, or at least I sure hoped so. And, nothing was working the way that I thought that it should. And I just really refused to accept this. And I'm glad that I did that. Even though this is a really hard place to be as a parent, the endless reading and the researching during hours that you should be sleeping, I'm sure you probably know what I'm talking about. But nothing was really meshing for us until I learned about PDA. And suddenly it felt like all the puzzle pieces came together. And of course, this puzzle is quite complex. My child, not so complex, but parenting her is. Parenting a kiddo with PDA takes things to another level because it requires a parenting paradigm shift. That's hard to say. As parents, we have to start parenting our kids from a brain based perspective, which is usually completely new for us. And supporting a PDA child usually looks much different than supporting neurotypical or neurodivergent kids. And that's because of the unique ways that their brains are wired. So, what exactly sets PDA brain wiring apart? The easiest way to approach that is to probably first talk about the core characteristics of PDA, and then we'll look a little bit inside the nervous system. The most defining characteristic, of course, is an extreme avoidance of everyday demands, like Elizabeth Newsom had seen. Also paired with an intense need, literally a biological drive for autonomy, and also a low tolerance for uncertainty. PDA kids often have nervous systems that are highly, highly sensitive to what they perceive as threats. Sometimes they even interpret very small, everyday requests as if they're life threatening. When their sense of autonomy or freedom is threatened, it triggers a massive anxiety response. And when I say massive, I mean their nervous systems react in a way that's similar to someone who's facing a life or death situation. So, what happens then when a PDA child feels threatened? Well, let's quickly break down what's going on inside a PDAer's brain when they feel like their autonomy is being threatened. Their amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for fear responses, sounds the alarm. It releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and this causes a chain reaction that affects their heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, sensory processing, memory integration, and it even begins to shut down access to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain here behind your forehead, the part of the brain that is responsible for higher level learning, problem solving, and language skills. So on the outside, you might see behaviors like stubborn refusal or what looks like defiance, or even an aggressive meltdown. But what's really happening is a physiological response to a perceived threat. And remember, that's perceived threat, that's their perception. Even if that threat is something as simple as brushing their teeth or getting ready for school. And believe me, I totally get how hard it is to see these outward behaviors and match them to an internal process. As a parent of a teen with PDA autism, I have lived through this firsthand. So, my daughter wasn't diagnosed with autism until she was 16. And we figured out the PDA piece probably by the time she was 17. But for over a decade, she was struggling. and she was misdiagnosed with so many other conditions, one of which was bipolar disorder, because her behaviors seemed so extreme. She would go from seemingly 1 minute being happy and calm to completely melting down the next moment. And we just had no idea why. We also used to think she was overly controlling. She always had to be in charge when playing with her friends or playing with her sister. And when she was very young, we would actually watch her leading all the other kids around, and we would say, wow, she's never going to have any problems with her social life. Look at that. But we didn't realize what was actually happening. And when she lost that control or started to, things fell apart. So now I can look back and understand that what seemed like controlling behavior was actually her way of managing her environment to avoid this uncertainty that comes along with peer relationships, other little kids, or it's very unpredictable. So she was trying to control her environment to avoid that uncertainty and to maintain a sense of safety. But at that time, of course, even all of our mental health professionals, they had no idea what was going on as well. I actually had 3 different psychiatrists at different times over the years describe her to me as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, which is a Winston Churchill quote. And basically, it's a fancy way of saying they had no idea what the hell was going on. So it wasn't until we learned about PDA that everything started to make sense. And once I understood how her nervous system was wired, I could see the patterns and the triggers more clearly, and things became a little easier to manage most of the time. So before I wrap up this first part of our PDA intro, because I think it's starting to run a little long, I want to touch on one more hallmark characteristic of PDA, and it is probably the most confounding characteristic. And that is the can't not won't phenomenon. The can't not won't phenomenon. This is when a PDAer is physically or emotionally unable to do something, even if they really, really want to. Their nervous system perceives whatever it is as a demand, and their threat response kicks in. Or it could also be just a threat to their autonomy. It doesn't have to be an actual demand, but their nervous system response kicks in. It prevents them from following through. For example, your child might be super excited to go to a birthday party or a sports game they've been looking forward to all week. But when the time comes, they can't get out of the car. Or maybe they want to join in on a family outing, but they can't get out of bed that morning. And it's not that they won't do it, it's that they literally can't do it. And sometimes this leads to like a cognitive loop for them, which is so difficult. So they can't do the thing, but they want to do the thing. So they get very upset with themselves for being unable to do it, which causes them to be even more stuck in this fight, flight, or freeze survival response. And it's a horrible, horrible loop to get stuck inside. It's crucial to remember that this is not about defiance or rebellion. It is a survival response that is happening at a subconscious level, triggered by their nervous system. It is so important to recognize this and parent from this place because our kids need our support. They need to be heard and validated and parented with empathy and connection. Their nervous systems are not going to heal. They are not going to regulate if we as their parents are not providing enough cues of safety. So this is probably a good place to pause. We'll dive more into the complexities of PDA and strategies for managing these challenges in future episodes. I hope today's introduction has been helpful, especially if you're new to PDA. Be sure to turn into part 2, where we'll cover some of the social characteristics of PDA. We'll talk about what they look like, how they often show up in everyday life. Thank you so much for joining me today. Remember, you are not alone on this journey. We are all learning together, and I'm here to support you every step of the way.